Off the top, though, let's go live to Miami, where the Justice Department unveiled criminal charges against former Cuban President Raúl Castro. This is related to Cuba's 1996 shoot-down of humanitarian planes. U.S. leaders told CBS News earlier this month Castro would face those charges. Castro stepped down as leader in 2021, but remains a powerful figure in Cuba. So let's go live to Miami and CBS News correspondent Cristian Benavides. Cristian, Castro's 94 years old at this point. As we look at that split screen and we see that podium there, the big question right now, why charge him at this age?
Right, a lot of questions. I mean, is the U.S. Justice Department and the Trump administration going to take an additional step and actually bring Raúl Castro here to Miami to face justice? I mean, that's the question. It's not clear whether they would do that or whether they would use this indictment as a pressure point in order to enact regime change in Cuba. Just a few moments ago, the indictment was announced. Sources had told CBS News that this was going to happen today. And just a few moments ago, I heard cheering from a crowd of Cuban Americans that's standing outside the Freedom Tower here in Miami, where that press conference is set to be held. Now, this indictment all has to do with the shoot down of two humanitarian planes, the humanitarian planes part of Brothers to the Rescue. This was a group that went out into the Florida Straits, went out into international waters, and helped Cubans who were making their way from the communist island looking for freedom, and they were making their way here to Miami. So they had a fleet of about 10 planes that would go out and help Cubans who were in distress. They also participated in some pro-democracy missions, which included dropping leaflets on the communist island. Back in 1996, two of their planes were shot down. There was a third plane that was not shot down, and 4 people died. That includes 3 U.S. citizens and 1 U.S. resident. The Cuban American community here in Miami has for decades been calling for change in Cuba, and for the past 3 decades calling for justice for those 4 men who were killed on that day. And as I mentioned just moments ago, when that indictment was announced, we heard cheering outside of the Freedom Tower. We're still waiting to hear from a number of speakers that are set to list off what the charges are going to be and just give us a sense of what else is in this indictment.
All right, Cristian Benavides, as we hear word of the cheers that likely come from generations of families who remember. Thank you so much. Turning now to CBS News intelligence and national security reporter Olivia Gazis. Olivia, we're still watching that podium to see who steps forward there, but Secretary of State Marco Rubio addressed the Cuban people in a video message earlier. What was the message?
That's right. Well, this was the first time that Rubio, who himself is the son of Cuban immigrants, spoke directly to the Cuban people as Secretary of State. And he chose to do it in Spanish and on the day that Cuba marks its independence from Spain and U.S. occupation. It was a sharp salvo against the government, as he has been doing. He said he blamed the government as the reason that the Cuban people have no electricity, no food, no fuel. He pointed to this business conglomerate run by the Cuban military, Gazis, which controls most of the Cuban economy, as the main obstacle standing between the Cuban people and a better future, both domestically and in relation to the United States. And he reiterated this offer that the U.S. has been dangling of $100 million in humanitarian aid to be delivered directly to the Cuban people through Catholic charities. But officials that we've spoken to say that money hasn't yet moved. Negotiations are still continuing. Of course, Rubio's message sought to cast the U.S. and this administration in a sort of cooperative, benevolent light, but it's absolutely worth noting that Cuba's primary energy lifeline, which were these oil deliveries that came directly from Venezuela, evaporated virtually overnight after the U.S. removed Nicolas Maduro from power earlier this year. That, along with these punishing sanctions that the U.S. has levied on Cuban officials and institutions, has been a significant factor in pushing Cuba into one of the worst humanitarian and economic crises that it's seen in decades, Reed.
Such an inflection point. I used to live in Miami. I've covered this issue deeply, and I would imagine that the reaction will be resoundingly positive there in Miami if we hear more indictments of other Cuban officials. What are you hearing about that?
That's right. Well, I think that we are just learning what we had been reporting earlier, that the Justice Department is expected to unveil, or has unveiled now, an indictment of Cuba's 94-year-old former leader and defense minister Raúl Castro with what appear to be 5 others on charges that we believe will be related to the shoot down, as Cristian was telling you, of humanitarian planes in 1996. So you've heard this administration call the Cuban government corrupt. You've heard them call it incompetent, and now they are also seeking to label it as criminal with this federal indictment. And Reed, these legal moves are following a number of these other screw-tightening measures that this administration has reached for, including, again, the fresh sanctions. We got another swath on Monday against top military and intelligence officials, and at the same time, trying to keep a diplomatic track alive and progressing. Last week, dispatching the CIA director to meet with senior officials in Havana. And again, this humanitarian relief package that appears to be tied to the same demand that this administration has had, that the government in Cuba make requisite political changes that make it more palatable to the U.S. The question, of course, is whether those changes actually happen or whether those in power in Cuba really buckle down to outlast even more crushing American pressure.
Yeah, and we know this is a major voting bloc, and they are political, and they are politically active. You know, I've stood on the waters there, the shoreline of Miami. I've seen people arrive from Cuba who got into Miami through the wet foot, dry foot policy, and they all get off those boats, and they all say, Fidel Castro, Raúl Castro destroyed our families' businesses. In what sense is this indictment against Raúl Castro also symbolic, and the Cuban people for generations feeling like this is perhaps some comeuppance for Fidel Castro and the Castro regime at large?
Absolutely. It is symbolic insofar as Raúl Castro, as we've pointed out, is 94 years old. Even though he's not currently in power, he still wields an enormous amount of influence in Cuban politics. And Reed, we should say that the Cuban government has been trying to strenuously deny that it poses an active military threat to the United States. Its officials have said that it is not an aggressor, that it is combating outsized influence from the United States and doesn't harbor any threat. This has come as there's been sorry, my phone is going off here.
Listen, you're a reporter. Your sources are calling you. We understand, friend. It's okay.
Sorry about that. This is coming as we've heard reports of drones that the Cuban government has accumulated, and whether those would be a factor should there be an external military confrontation. Now, we do not sense that one is imminent, but it has become more of a possibility as, again, the United States has pointed to the need for the government to demonstrate that it is willing to change in order to get to a more cooperative relationship, is what we understood the CIA director to have relayed to senior officials there. That the U.S. pointing to what they see as a productive relationship now in Venezuela, wants to see a different set of leadership at the top and wants to engage economically to the extent that is possible, but it won't be possible with the interlocutors that it currently has there.
All right, Olivia, thank you so much. We likely will be checking back into you as news breaks throughout this hour. Thank you so much. Good to talk to you. Let's go back to Miami and CBS News correspondent Cristian Benavides there. You know, I'm always fascinated in covering this story. I remember also standing at a prominent cathedral, I know you'll know the name of it, that pays tribute to those who came through rough waters to come to the shores of the United States. If you can capture this moment from the perspective of the mothers and fathers, the grandmothers, the grandfathers, and what the significance of this is, not only is this indictment connected to the 1996 downing of planes, but this has also got to be symbolic for so many families who say they suffered under the Castro regime, lost their businesses, lost their homes, and many of them died.
Reed, absolutely. I mean, you have to think about the families that had their businesses seized and that had to live through this brutal authoritarian regime that is still in power. Now, it's important to note that Cuba is at one of its weakest, if not the weakest moment that it has ever been. So people here in South Florida see what's happening on the island. They do see it. They see their family members suffering through the blackout, suffering through the lack of food and through those brutal conditions. But overwhelmingly, the belief here is that change may be around the corner for so many Cuban Americans who live here in South Florida. I spoke to Jose Basulto, who was on the third plane. I mentioned, these humanitarian planes that are at the center of this indictment. Two of them were shut down. Jose Basulto was on the third plane, and he watched his friends be killed on international waters by the Cuban regime. And what he told me was that he feels that change in Cuba is closer than it ever has been before in the past. And I'll tell you, there's a small crowd that's right outside the Freedom Tower, and every so often we hear them cheering. I don't know what they're watching, but we hear them cheering, and
right.
We hear the joy from so many Cuban Americans who are here in South Florida. After seeing what happened in Venezuela, one thing that I would caution is that in Venezuela, you have Delcy Rodriguez, who is still part of the Maduro regime that is
right.
in power there, though they are collaborating with the United States. Here, when you talk to Cuban Americans, they'll tell you directly that they do not want to see anyone from the regime still in power. And it is so difficult to find someone within the Cuban regime that could hold a position similar to Delcy, because most of the opposition lives here in Miami because they were either imprisoned in Cuba or had to flee from the communist island. So it is truly remarkable to hear the hope that so many Cuban Americans here have. They are ready for this change. They have been waiting for change in Cuba for decades, and they're seeing the humanitarian crisis that has been unfolding on the island, and they've been watching what the administration has been doing and hoping that they would be able to enact some sort of regime change.
I'm so jealous that you're there to get to record this story in real time. I think of the inscription at the base of the Statue of Liberty about huddled masses yearning to be free. That really typifies and captures the spirit of so many Cuban Americans there, likely toasting themselves with some Café Versailles cafecito today. Nice to talk to you. As soon as we see somebody at that podium, we'll bring it to you. Cristian Benavides, excellent reporting as always. All right, so we're also getting granular here. We're looking at what's in that indictment. So let's go live to CBS News Justice reporter Jake Rosen. You're starting to dig into it and see what the line items are. What are you seeing so far?
Yeah, that's right, Reed. We are waiting on the full indictment to be unsealed, but as these kind of trickle of court filings have come in, we do have an initial set and read on what the charges are alleged against former Cuban leader Raúl Castro. The first charge, as Cristian has spoken about in depth here, is conspiracy to kill U.S. nationals. That is just a singular count. There are 2 counts of a destruction of aircraft, as Cristian just pointed out. 2 of those brothers to the rescue planes were shot down in the 1990s, carrying U.S. citizens and a U.S. resident, and that leads to the final charge, which is 4 counts of murder. And as Cristian just pointed out, it was 3 U.S. citizens who were on board those planes attempting to rescue Cubans who were fleeing the island, and there was 1 U.S. resident who was also killed. We are waiting on a full unsealing of this indictment, I would assume, just given how the Department of Justice typically plays things out. It could come at any moment as we await this presser, or meanwhile, while Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche and other law enforcement heads are set to be discussing this in depth. And I think one moment of clarity that we will get, just like the Nicolas Maduro indictment, was how deeply involved can the United States allege the involvement went from the top down of the government. As we know, in a similar comparison, it's likely that they're going to allege that simply because he's the former head of the country, that he had some direct knowledge of the order or directly ordered the shooting down of these planes. How granular can the United States get in that indictment? Do they have potential witnesses or documentation to back up these charges? And we will certainly find out more in a couple of moments on specifics.
I know you'll have it. Thank you so much. We appreciate that.